In a coordinated overnight maneuver, the European Union implemented a full-spectrum suspension of all multi-entry Schengen visas issued to citizens of the Russian Federation. The directive, enacted through synchronized intergovernmental protocols, initiated a zone-wide cancellation of travel authorizations across all member states, accompanied by an immediate revocation order embedded within the border control information systems. The operational consequence was the abrupt disconnection of civilian mobility between Russian territory and continental Europe, achieved not through physical barriers or transport bans but through administrative invalidation of the legal mechanisms underpinning movement. The affected perimeter spans the entirety of the EU's external frontier, from the land crossings along the Baltic and Finnish axes to the air corridors accessing Central European hubs. Russian passport holders, previously authorized to travel under active multi-entry visas, awoke to discover their legal access nullified by back-end database reconfiguration. Border systems classified previously valid entries as cancelled, without prior warning or transitional provisions. Air travelers encountered system lockouts during check-in procedures, while land border crossers were halted by routine scans now returning null status results. The strategic effect was instantaneous immobilization without visible enforcement escalation, an administrative shutdown implemented by remote command across multiple jurisdictions. This action represents the first instance of continent-wide travel system recalibration targeting a specific nationality through the Schengen architecture. The scale exceeds prior sanction regimes and diverges from targeted listings by applying uniform nullification to non-political entities, students, retirees, family visitors, digital professionals, and cross-border commuters. Border authorities were instructed to apply no exceptions, and centralized coordination platforms received updated rejection protocols for all categories of multi-entry issuance. The decision was executed under confidentiality, with no advance communication to Russian authorities or public entities. No pre-notification was distributed to affected travelers or institutional intermediaries. Embassies suspended processing activities and initiated retroactive invalidation of issued documentation. In parallel, bilateral transport agreements referencing Schengen access were rendered non-functional, collapsing the administrative logic of transit between Russia and European destination nodes. Infrastructurally, the closure transforms Europe's eastern border into a one-directional perimeter, where movement is possible outward but not inward. This creates a zone of asymmetrical accessibility. Russian citizens may exit European territory but cannot re-enter, and those inside the Federation cannot initiate travel toward EU space. No consular representation was authorized to override the cancellation protocols. Appeal channels were frozen at issuance level. Border units were instructed to process each denial as final and non-negotiable. Within the Russian Federation, the effect replicated a lockdown scenario without internal declaration. Citizens possessing valid documentation for education, medical treatment, property management, or professional engagement abroad became immobilized not by force but by system logic. The European legal space, once configured as a matrix of overlapping freedoms and predictable access, was algorithmically closed overnight. The border did not shift physically, but its legal architecture was recalibrated to exclude an entire population class. The strategic perimeter was not militarized, it was administratively neutralized. The operational execution of the Schengen cancellation unfolded as a system-wide recalibration of visa verification databases across multiple European jurisdictions. The technical mechanism relied on the Central Schengen Information System, which serves as the backbone for cross-border mobility control within the European Union. At the designated activation window, the database received synchronized directives from the European Council's Migration Security Division, automatically flagging all active multi-entry visas associated with Russian passport identifiers as revoked. This update propagated through national border nodes, airline check-in interfaces, and consular data terminals, ensuring instant uniformity of enforcement. No transitional status or grace period was coded. The update was absolute, binary, and irreversible at the user level. Within minutes of implementation, hundreds of terminals across airports and checkpoints displayed identical notification strings: visa invalid, entry denied. The first disruption appeared in air corridors connecting Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kaliningrad with European hubs. Passengers arriving for scheduled flights encountered system blockages at registration counters. Airlines received alerts from the European Passenger Name Record Network, instructing carriers to deny boarding to passengers whose visa identifiers had been reclassified. Automated check-in systems cross-referenced the updated visa registry, returning rejections before physical verification could occur. Airport staff, following standard protocols, were prohibited from issuing boarding passes once system validation failed. Within hours, queues began to form at departure gates, composed primarily of citizens unaware of the directive. Conversations shifted from confusion to collective realization as repeated scanning attempts confirmed that the denials were not isolated technical errors but part of a continent-wide enforcement procedure. Supervisors instructed staff to clear terminals of non-departing passengers, while customs officers maintained operational silence, citing data mismatch as the only official explanation. At land borders, the impact produced scenes of procedural paralysis. Travelers arriving at the Narvai-Vangarad, Volomodorfianovka, and Tiraspol-Brest crossings were processed according to standard verification routines until border terminals updated their authorization modules. Once the recalibration reached frontline systems, all Russian passport entries linked to Schengen multi-entry codes were classified under cancellation protocol. Guards received live briefings via secure internal channels, instructing them to detain travel documents for verification, stamp refusal records, and redirect travelers to national re-entry points. This created immediate congestion along primary crossing routes. Vehicles accumulated in multi-kilometer queues, unable to advance or return. Within the first operational day, land exits to Finland and Estonia recorded complete standstill, with border throughput dropping to near zero. Secondary crossings, typically used for private transport and commercial cargo, were placed under observation, though freight movement continued under separate classifications. Civilian crossings were effectively frozen. The most acute impact emerged within urban transit nodes inside the Russian Federation. Major airports reported surges of passengers attempting to confirm the validity of their travel documents. Airline call centers were overloaded, with waiting times exceeding operational thresholds. Embassy switchboards across European capitals registered unprecedented inbound volume from Russian citizens demanding clarification or emergency reissuance. None of these channels provided actionable information. Automated responses indicated that all multi-entry Schengen visas of Russian issuance origin were suspended, pending security review, a euphemism masking permanent deactivation. Social media activity mirrored a pattern of synchronized realization. Within hours, digital platforms recorded an exponential rise in posts containing phrases such as "visa not valid," "border closed," and "system error at airport." Telegram and VK channels dedicated to travel coordination transformed into emergency message boards, where users exchanged screenshots of denial screens and entry refusal stamps. The communication tone shifted from disbelief to administrative panic as evidence accumulated that the lockout extended across every Schengen jurisdiction. The decision's architecture ensured complete information asymmetry. Russian authorities received no prior diplomatic notification and no technical alert. Domestic border control systems were not synchronized with the Schengen network, leaving Russian agencies blind to the status shift until reports surfaced from stranded citizens abroad. Airports and consular offices issued no statements, maintaining operational silence under central directive. The absence of official response amplified civilian disorientation. Families separated by border status found themselves unable to reunite. Students enrolled in European institutions received notices of enrollment suspension due to absence. Corporate employees stationed abroad faced contract termination clauses triggered by non-appearance. Individuals seeking medical treatment in EU states lost access to scheduled procedures as their travel documents ceased recognition. For residents with dual logistics, housing or education abroad, the lockout dismantled entire segments of their personal infrastructure overnight. The speed of execution reflected deliberate intent to minimize anticipation or circumvention. By initiating the cancellation at the database level rather than through public decree, the European Union ensured there would be no preemptive departures or mass movements preceding enforcement. Travelers who went to sleep with active visas became, by morning, subjects of administrative containment. The process did not require visible border militarization, arrests, or public announcements. It was executed entirely through the digital perimeter of European border architecture. The efficiency of this operation demonstrated how a modern mobility network could transform from a framework of freedom into an instrument of confinement through a single algorithmic adjustment. This mechanism produced secondary civilian effects not visible in previous sanction waves. Travel agencies, consular intermediaries, and logistics providers dependent on cross-border mobility entered immediate shutdown. Unused tickets became unrecoverable due to force majeure classifications. Health insurance contracts linked to travel policies were annulled automatically once visa invalidation triggered non-coverage clauses. Financial institutions processing tuition, mortgage, or residency payments within EU jurisdictions suspended operations with Russian account holders lacking active entry authorization. This cascade extended the effect of the visa cancellation far beyond transportation, converting what was nominally an administrative act into a societal immobilization. By the close of the first operational cycle, the Schengen perimeter had achieved complete administrative isolation of Russian civilian movement. No appeals were logged, no reauthorizations were processed, and no transitional pathways were introduced. The closure had been achieved through code rather than cordon, an invisible architecture of exclusion now binding millions within their own territory. In the hours following the widespread realization that multi-entry Schengen visas had been deactivated across the board, the Russian domestic sphere entered a phase of accelerated systemic dislocation. This dislocation was not characterized by physical disorder or protest, but by a structural collapse of the informal architecture that had, for decades, allowed segments of Russian society to function in dual geography mode, domiciled within the Russian Federation yet economically, culturally, or logistically tethered to Europe. With the erasure of legal mobility overnight, these systems lost their foundation. Key among the affected demographics were students enrolled in European universities under long-term educational visa regimes. While educational grounds typically formed a distinct category within Schengen structures, the unilateral nature of the mass invalidation left no operational exceptions. Students already abroad were rendered unable to return following visits home, while those within the Federation faced immediate suspension notices from institutions unable to confirm their legal ability to enter EU territory. University portals issued mass advisories noting that any failure to appear within institutional deadlines would result in deregistration. Appeals could not be filed without border clearance confirmation. Entire cohorts of students found themselves involuntarily unenrolled, with academic credits, residency documents, and insurance policies entering invalidation cycles. International degrees, long regarded as an asset within professional pathways, were transformed into interrupted, unrecoverable fragments with no legal or procedural route to completion. In parallel, families with children in European private schools or international academies faced unsolvable coordination dilemmas. Guardians unable to travel could not retrieve dependents, while institutions abroad declined to maintain custody without parental presence or consular endorsement. Diplomatic intervention was not available, and school administrations activated liability offboarding procedures. As a result, minors located abroad were either transferred into temporary care arrangements in Europe or removed from institutions entirely. This generated a secondary cascade in custody, tuition finance, and travel documentation logistics, none of which could be resolved under current conditions. Multiple legal offices within Moscow and St. Petersburg reported spikes in consultations related to underage repatriation, but without functional transit or visa reactivation, no actionable outcomes were achieved. Individuals maintaining property assets within European Union jurisdictions encountered forced absence scenarios. Property management firms were informed of owner inaccessibility and responded by initiating emergency third-party oversight or legal escrow transfers, depending on local law. In some cases, unpaid maintenance fees triggered foreclosure warnings. Residential accounts registered under Russian nationals were placed under regulatory review, and financial institutions froze property-linked accounts absent physical presence verification. Real estate advisors reported dozens of inquiry cases in the first operational week, all bearing identical characteristics: ownership with no access, financial obligation with no banking interface, and no timeline for reinstatement. Assets in Spain, Germany, and France, traditional destinations for mid-tier Russian ownership, entered suspension procedures as local authorities implemented security review guidelines regarding absentee landlords of sanctioned national origin. Professional structures collapsed along similar lines. A significant portion of Russia's high-income professional class operated in a distributed model, working for EU-based firms under residency or mobility frameworks, traveling regularly under Schengen authorization. With visas cancelled, employment contracts entered breach conditions. Companies based in the Netherlands, Germany, and the Baltic states issued termination notices citing inability to fulfill on-site attendance or project coordination clauses. Remote work frameworks previously tolerated under travel-enabled flexibility were withdrawn once it became clear that physical mobility was indefinitely suspended. Russian professionals lost access to tax registration, social security contributions, and bank accounts within host states. Digital economy operatives, including IT specialists, consultants, and creatives, were among the most affected. The informal model of working for Europe while residing in Russia was invalidated in a single enforcement cycle. Medical travel, long a critical pathway for complex procedures unavailable domestically, ceased to exist as a functional option. Patients with ongoing treatment cycles in European clinics were unable to attend follow-up appointments, while those scheduled for surgeries received cancellation notices due to non-compliance with entry validation requirements. Medical facilities abroad, citing legal and insurance protocols, terminated treatment plans. Appeals to embassies produced no exemptions. Domestic private clinics reported an uptick in high-cost procedure requests, though capabilities remained below European standards. The cancellation of access to medical mobility exposed a structural dependence long obscured by the illusion of choice. Russian elites, previously insulated by cross-border healthcare access, now found themselves fully reliant on internal infrastructure without warning or preparation. Social response channels reflected a uniform psychological pattern: shock, denial, confusion, and system-wide information saturation. Telegram channels dedicated to travel, legal advice, or immigration became overwhelmed with identical queries. How do I leave? Is the cancellation permanent? What happens to my school/hospital/job/property? Public figures traditionally connected to international mobility, travel bloggers, real estate agents, legal consultants, went silent or issued ambiguous statements confirming the situation without providing guidance. Official media maintained a full blackout. State-owned outlets made no mention of the Schengen revocation, framing any reporting on international affairs around unrelated diplomatic themes. No official comment was issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and consular departments instructed staff to refer all inquiries to non-existent appeal channels. The government silence functioned not as omission but as psychological reinforcement of containment. Without acknowledgement, no escalation could be legitimized. Without escalation, no negotiation could be triggered. This operational ambiguity trapped the affected population within an informational vacuum. The absence of clarity deepened the sense of immobilization. Those locked out of Europe were simultaneously locked into a silence that mirrored the closure itself. The model of Russian-European civilian integration, fragmented but operational, legally sanctioned but informally structured, collapsed under a bureaucratic act executed beyond Russian jurisdiction. The erasure of the visa layer removed not just a document class, but an entire stratum of civilian interaction with the external world. It dismantled the pathways of education, healthcare, employment, property, and transit. What remained was a single operational status applied universally: non-entry. As civilian mobility collapsed under the weight of algorithmic exclusion, attention shifted to the behavior of state and institutional structures within the Russian Federation. The cancellation of Schengen access, although strictly external in execution, triggered an internal chain of administrative stasis and communicative suppression. Government agencies, tasked with travel facilitation, visa assistance, and international coordination, entered a phase of procedural denial. No ministry assumed responsibility for clarification. No coordination center was established. The strategic choice to absorb the blow silently transformed a mass administrative event into an unspoken state of internal lockdown. Key ministries, including Foreign Affairs, Education, Health, and Communications, issued no policy directives, media briefings, or advisories. This absence of top-down response was replicated downward through institutional hierarchies. Passport offices received no update protocols. Universities hosting outbound exchange programs suspended international modules without public notice. Private medical firms offering European referrals withdrew services quietly. Call centers associated with legal, banking, and insurance sectors instructed operators to defer all questions related to visa status. The absence of procedural flow created an impression of informational dead air, where the machinery of international access once operated but now emitted no signals. Within 48 hours, even unofficial explanations ceased, replaced by auto-generated notices citing technical difficulties or systemic verification delays. This suppression was not logistical but strategic. By refraining from acknowledging the visa shutdown, state structures avoided triggering contractual obligations or legal commitments to those affected. No emergency support was authorized. No policy adjustment was initiated. This absence of action left stranded individuals with no interface to the state. Without a point of appeal, the paralysis became total. The strategic function of this silence was to isolate the consequences from the architecture of domestic legitimacy. If the event remained officially unconfirmed, its implications remained unofficial. Therefore, no mechanism of blame, compensation, or remediation could be activated. Institutional disengagement became a form of control. This disengagement extended into border management. Russian frontier services received no reciprocal instruction to mirror or counter the European shutdown. Instead, customs and passport control maintained pre-existing routines, processing outbound travel attempts as if visas remained valid. Only when travelers were returned from European terminals or denied boarding by airlines did the impossibility of exit materialize. There was no coordination between the Russian and European sides, no synchronized interface, no joint protocol. Travelers were processed into a zone that had been closed in absentia. The outbound leg functioned, the inbound reception did not exist. In practical terms, the border became a one-way airlock. The door opened, but the destination had vanished. This asymmetry reinforced the sense of entrapment. Citizens retained the theoretical ability to move but lacked any destination within the European framework. Alternative destinations, such as the Middle East, Central Asia, or select Asian hubs, remained technically accessible, but they did not replicate the social, educational, or economic functions that the Schengen space had previously provided. Russian society had not built redundancy for this function. Europe had been the default vector for long-term integration abroad. With that corridor closed, no immediate substitute held equivalent legitimacy, scale, or institutional depth. The closure was not of geography, but of function. The response within digital ecosystems reflected this structural absence. Major social platforms associated with civic engagement, travel documentation, or legal navigation registered spikes in request volume, but no content guidance. Independent legal firms ceased offering Schengen-related services, deleting website sections and suspending advertising. Civil society organizations focused on cross-border cooperation issued disclaimers confirming inability to assist. Not only was no information available, there was no framework within which such information could be requested. The architecture of navigation, once robust through intermediaries and decentralized knowledge channels, collapsed. The informational terrain was cleared of signposts. Users entered queries into a space no longer capable of answering. Amid this informational void, state-aligned media initiated a controlled diversion cycle. Rather than acknowledge the closure, programming focused on unrelated themes, cultural programming, foreign instability, and historical retrospectives. News cycles avoided travel, education, or medical logistics altogether. The word visa was absent from major headlines. When questioned publicly, spokespersons redirected attention to broad diplomatic themes unrelated to Schengen structure. The strategy was consistent: absorb without reflection. By removing visibility, the event would not escalate. This media posture matched internal administrative logic, where silence replaced coordination and ambiguity replaced policy. The net result of this institutional vacuum was a psychological perimeter identical to the physical border: static, opaque, and closed. Individuals unable to travel encountered systems unable to respond. Agencies responsible for international facilitation functioned as though the infrastructure still existed. The illusion of continuity persisted within domestic systems. Applications could still be filed, questions could still be submitted, but the external endpoint no longer accepted connections. The structure remained, but its exit node had been erased. This created a paradoxical condition where the state appeared operational while the population remained immobilized. Visas could be printed but not used. Appointments could be booked but not honored. Courses could be enrolled but not attended. The model resembled a digital simulation detached from outcome, an interface preserved for optical stability despite its external disconnection. Institutions operated as if nothing had occurred, reinforcing the cognitive dissonance at the civilian level. No bridge was available between function and effect. The closure of the Schengen vector thus became a strategic containment achieved without domestic confrontation. It was not declared, resisted, or negotiated. It was absorbed. The Russian state maintained outward continuity while internally isolating its population from a geographic and symbolic structure that had underpinned decades of mobility, legitimacy, and aspirational alignment. The system of outward engagement was not dismantled. It was simply turned off, without announcement, without alternative, and without return path. As the full spectrum of consequences emerged across administrative, psychological, and infrastructural layers, a final transition took place: the functional reclassification of Russian citizenship in the global mobility system. This was not a formal decree but a cumulative status shift, executed through systemic exclusion and confirmed by the absence of response. The Russian passport, previously recognized within the matrix of global semi-mobility, was no longer operational within the Schengen framework. Its holders were no longer travelers but statically domiciled nationals of a state redefined by external systems as non-integratable. This reclassification occurred not through designation, but through negation. The mechanism of this transformation was administrative redundancy. The invalidation of multi-entry visas functionally removed Russians from the legal category of repeatable external actors. Without a reusable access structure, mobility was reduced to theoretical singularity, no guarantee of re-entry, no framework for sustained interaction. This downgraded status was reinforced by procedural blocks within consular pipelines. Embassies across the European Union suspended visa appointments for Russian citizens indefinitely. Online scheduling portals were shut down. Application centers ceased issuing slots. Even categories previously considered protected, humanitarian, familial, academic, were placed under temporary hold, with no published reactivation date. The infrastructure of reintegration was dismantled, severing the procedural continuity that had previously defined the post-sanction mobility era. As this exclusion became systemic, it forced a transformation of civilian planning logic. Individuals and families operating under long-term assumptions of eventual return, remote work, or phased emigration were compelled to reassess viability timelines. Financial plans connected to cross-border living, including tuition financing, property leasing, dual-location employment contracts, and interregional health coverage, became unsustainable. The closure of mobility rendered every cross-border obligation unserviceable. Travel dependencies converted into liabilities. Bank accounts registered in EU jurisdictions flagged transactions for review. Wire transfers to educational or residential facilities abroad were placed under secondary compliance protocols. Residency permits conditioned on regular presence were revoked or downgraded. Each function previously anchored to the possibility of movement failed under conditions of non-access. The administrative reality redefined the holder not as temporarily interrupted, but structurally excluded. Attempts to reroute mobility toward alternate jurisdictions exposed additional limits. While non-Schengen states technically remained accessible, including segments of the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Gulf, and Central Asia, none offered continuity of the previously held European status. Visa-free access permitted tourism but denied residency, employment, or medical care. Education infrastructure lacked compatibility with European qualifications. Legal frameworks did not support property protection, long-term integration, or consular advocacy at scale. Russian nationals attempting redirection faced fractured systems with minimal institutional depth and high volatility. The replacement of Schengen functionality proved unachievable within available geopolitical options. The strategic advantage once provided by dual orientation was dismantled. This induced a mass contraction in strategic planning. Cross-border relocation efforts were abandoned. International program applications were withdrawn. Residency applications under investment or heritage schemes were frozen by host states citing compliance review. Inter-Russian migration trends accelerated as families reoriented toward domestic education and healthcare centers. The demand structure within elite service sectors, previously driven by external facilitation, collapsed. International school waiting lists were replaced by withdrawal notices. Language training centers recorded record cancellation rates. Legal consultancy firms specializing in emigration or dual status optimization closed operations. The support ecosystem built around the mobility of the upper middle class entered liquidation. At the level of public sentiment, the reclassification produced a psychological schism. Citizens previously buffered by access to Europe were now subject to the same structural immobility as lower-tier demographics. The stratification of society along lines of international access was erased. All holders of Russian documents were equalized within the category of exclusion. This redefinition destroyed the distinction between those who could leave and those who could not. A single policy layer reduced a complex web of privilege, strategy, and exception into uniform immobility. In the context of Russian internal dynamics, this effect was unparalleled. Unlike previous waves of emigration suppression, defined by war, poverty, or ideology, this wave was implemented by external systems targeting access alone. No countermechanism was visible. No appeals process, lobbying campaign, or diplomatic correction was initiated. The Russian state issued no threat of reciprocity, no gesture of protest, and no pathway to reinstatement. The silence confirmed strategic acceptance. With no corrective action, the new status became permanent. The absence of feedback from the state functioned as final admission. The reclassification had been absorbed and accepted. In legal terms, the Russian citizen ceased to be a participant in the European mobility framework. In practical terms, he ceased to be a mobile subject of the globalized world. The meaning of this disjunction extended beyond policy. It redefined the geopolitical imagination of Russia's civilian class. The map of the possible was redrawn. Europe no longer existed as a reachable configuration. It became a visual artifact, present on maps, unreachable in practice. The routes that once linked airports, rail lines, and educational platforms became symbolic echoes. Entire industries, civil aviation, legal relocation, consular logistics, international commerce, adjusted to this rupture as the new operational norm. The geopolitical identity of the Russian civilian transitioned from semi-peripheral to landlocked. This transformation was not caused by war or overt decree, but by the surgical withdrawal of access. Through a single system recalibration, the European Union did not merely block movement. It altered the social fabric, economic orientation, and long-term calculus of an entire population stratum. This was not a border closure. It was an identity rewrite, executed silently, irreversibly, and with bureaucratic precision. The Russians did not leave Europe. Europe removed the Russians. Following the procedural freeze and reclassification of status, the internal and external contours of Russia's mobility system underwent involuntary stabilization. This stabilization was not a return to equilibrium but a hardening of post-access conditions. All vectors of exit, redirection, or diplomatic correction became static. The infrastructure designed for perpetual movement, legal, technical, economic, remained physically intact but functionally disabled. The system did not adapt. It locked into its new configuration, operational without destination, procedural without result. Internally, the bureaucratic system responsible for mobility continued to produce documents, schedule appointments, and process applications. Foreign passport renewals remained active. Legal notaries continued to validate international powers of attorney. Travel agencies advertised generic overseas packages with updated disclaimers. However, none of these functions translated into actual movement toward the Schengen space. The formality of process was preserved, but the endpoint had been nullified. A full architectural simulation of movement existed without outcome. The procedural ecosystem served no practical purpose beyond appearance. Individuals could plan, pay, prepare, but not depart. In this frozen framework, residual activity persisted in hope of exception. Families maintained embassy correspondence files. Students submitted deferred enrollment letters. Medical patients retained contact with EU clinics. Professionals kept international bank accounts active. But none of these efforts produced movement. The structure of hope remained, but its algorithmic pathway had been erased. No exception was granted. No isolated approval was issued. All entries flagged under Russian passport identity remained blocked. The border, once selective, had become absolute. Externally, the European Union did not issue a clarifying directive. The initial wave of cancellations was not followed by supplemental announcements, technical briefings, or strategic roadmaps. The decision remained unexpanded, and the architecture of denial remained unadjusted. No member state issued a dissenting position. Border agencies maintained real-time database synchronization, receiving nightly updates confirming continued null status of affected visas. Airline coordination systems removed Russian multi-entry visa categories from selection menus. Travel insurance providers issued mass policy freezes for all Russian citizens attempting to initiate EU-linked plans. No restoration logic was introduced. The system was not in rollback. It had entered long-term operational denial. Secondary partners aligned with EU regulatory frameworks mirrored the freeze. Swiss and Norwegian enforcement platforms synchronized border logic with Schengen protocols. Balkan states participating in visa waiver programs issued temporary moratoriums pending clarification. Even non-EU countries receiving high volumes of Russian travelers, such as Turkey and the UAE, activated enhanced due diligence procedures for Russian arrivals. The effect was a regional ripple, not an embargo, but a slowdown, caution, and algorithmic friction at all contact points. The Schengen shutdown metastasized into broader mobility hesitation, confirming the reclassification as a global signal. The Russian Federation, faced with this irreversible restructuring, took no corrective position. The absence of a state narrative hardened into silence policy. Government ministries continued routine function without acknowledging that outbound civilian flow had been structurally annulled. Annual foreign travel statistics were not published. Cross-border university cooperation programs were suspended without replacement. No legal challenge was filed with European institutions. No reciprocal measure, symbolic or operational, was enacted. The state became a silent observer of its population's immobilization. This strategic muteness translated the loss of movement into a new social constant. The issue no longer required resolution. It was not framed as a dispute. It was coded as a condition. This condition fixed the civilian population into geographic stasis with digital overlays. Individuals continued to engage with online European platforms, for education, content, consumption, and communication, without physical access. Digital border crossing remained permitted, but physical movement was non-existent. This dichotomy generated a new psychological model: presence without presence, engagement without transit. Citizens navigated an external world they could not enter. The internet became a replica of movement in a reality where movement no longer existed. This fixation had a direct impact on youth behavior and demographic trajectory. Aspirational planning, previously structured around the possibility of departure, adjusted downward. Young professionals abandoned preparation for European relocation. Language acquisition rates dropped across urban centers. Foreign exam registration collapsed. Educational migration reoriented toward non-European institutions with diminished credentialing power. Career planning began anchoring inside national borders. A full cycle of future alignment retracted from external vectors. For the first time in 2 decades, the majority of Russian youth surveyed in metropolitan regions reported no actionable plan to seek permanent education or work abroad. Across institutional, technological, and psychological layers, the fixation was complete. The mobility interface had transformed from an open protocol to a static firewall. The Russian passport, now carrying a globally legible flag of denial, served as a badge of containment. The society it represented continued to function in procedural simulation, but its link to the outside world was broken. What had once been a system of choices narrowed to a single default state: internal permanence. There was no crisis to resolve. The system had locked. The state had adapted. The world had reclassified. The question was no longer how to reopen movement, but what it means to operate under permanent denial. The final stage of the Schengen visa revocation crisis was marked not by further escalation but by the normalization of exclusion. In the absence of diplomatic engagement, institutional protest, or procedural correction, the event transitioned from tactical shock to strategic fact. The Russian Federation ceased to possess legal access to the primary continental zone that had, for 3 decades, served as its principal vector of external civilian engagement. This rupture was not reabsorbed into the mobility architecture. It remained as a permanent subtraction, a structural amputation without prosthetic. At the systemic level, the revocation transformed the geopolitical identity of Russian society. The model of dual existence, internal residence combined with external participation, disintegrated. This model had sustained a transnational civilian class capable of operating in both spaces, earning domestically, spending abroad, learning in Europe, returning for employment, treating illnesses in foreign clinics, maintaining residence in Moscow or Kazan, investing in foreign property while remaining rooted in national bureaucratic structures. With the removal of access, this model expired. The dual citizen became a single-zone subject, geographically enclosed and administratively constrained. The concept of a partially integrated civilian disappeared from practice and from law. This contraction did not trigger internal reform or self-replacement strategies. Rather than constructing alternative infrastructures, regional educational hubs, parallel health corridors, or legal substitutes for transnational residency, the system adapted through omission. Institutions rewrote functionality to exclude the external. Universities canceled exchange partnerships. Hospitals ceased advertising international treatment packages. Travel agencies recalibrated to regional circuits. Government tenders for international cooperation projects were deleted from planning protocols. Mobility, once considered a tier of national capacity, was removed from the operational vocabulary of both state and private actors. The economic implications were non-trivial. Industries dependent on outbound civilian movement entered long-term contraction. These included not only travel and logistics but also financial services, education brokerage, immigration law, and luxury consumer markets. Real estate agencies managing foreign property portfolios for Russian clients liquidated holdings. International consultancy networks downgraded Russia-facing units. Visa processing centers were shut down or reoriented toward inbound services for limited markets. A full segment of the economy, quiet but profitable, vanished from national planning metrics. No replacement industry appeared. The closure was not offset. It was absorbed as shrinkage. The broader symbolic shift lay in the redefinition of Europe within Russian consciousness. It ceased to function as a space of optionality, for education, safety, recreation, or reinvention. It became instead a closed coordinate system, visible but unreachable. This psychological closure produced a recalibration of aspiration, particularly among urban middle-class youth. The idea of departure, once a default extension of ambition, lost traction. The desire to engage externally transformed into passive consumption of external content. Europe became a screen rather than a path. It was present in digital form but absent from material life. This alteration of orientation marked a generational reset. The external was no longer part of the plan. In strategic terms, this exclusion functioned as an alignment mechanism. By removing the population's capacity for autonomous European engagement, the external actors severed the link between domestic dissatisfaction and geographical exit. No longer could internal political or economic discomfort be relieved through emigration, temporary escape, or educational repositioning. The pressure that would previously have flowed outward remained within. The containment was not merely physical, it was socio-political. The inability to exit reinforced the need to adapt, suppress, or disengage. The system, now closed, required compliance or silence. The Russian state, by refusing to contest this arrangement, confirmed its own pivot away from European frameworks. The lack of countermeasure, protest, or even acknowledgement served as a signal to both internal and external audiences. The closure was accepted. The population was now structurally internal. No dual logic remained. The single-zone citizen had replaced the transnational participant. The passport remained valid in form but invalid in function. It served as a document of containment. In the broader context of European policy, the decision to revoke multi-entry visas represented a transition from targeted sanction to structural decoupling. It did not aim to punish individuals. It aimed to remove an interface, to make mobility legally impossible, diplomatically irreversible, and bureaucratically normalized. The result was not isolation in the Cold War sense, nor confrontation in the military sense. It was administrative deletion. The civilian bridge had been removed. Russia was no longer a partially connected node. It was a closed terminal. This condition, achieved silently and enforced algorithmically, altered the foundation of international civilian structure. Mobility, long presumed to be an inherent right or at least a negotiable function, was revealed to be a conditional privilege. That privilege had been withdrawn. Not because of individual action but because of geopolitical classification. The revocation of Schengen access marked the end of Russia's civil presence in Europe. What remains is a static geography, a sealed database, and a generation living inside a nation that now exists alone.